to something a little bit more positive. Actually, we have so many things here in our state to be excited about in terms of education reform. This has been happening for several years now with the help of the reformers in the General Assembly and in the governor's office. So as you know, our own Dr. Terry Stoops writes frequently about education policy and the things that we believe are important to allow parents to be able to have a range of choices that best meets the needs of their children. In our state, our new state operating budget, roughly 40% of it is dedicated to kindergarten through high school education. So today, Lisa Snell, who is with the Reason Foundation, she is Director of Education for that organization, she's going to talk with us about some of the latest changes in our own education policy that were set forth in the last General Assembly session. But she's also going to talk about national trends in school choice and education reform and what that could mean for those of us here in North Carolina. Now, Lisa, of course, is an expert in this area. She is with Reason Foundation. She's an old friend of our own Rick Henderson, who's managing editor of Carolina Journal. Rick, at one point, was with the folks at Reason. She has been testifying many times before the California State Legislature. She's considered an expert in this field. In fact, last year, my home state of Arizona, Governor Doug Ducey appointed Lisa to the Classrooms First Commission to help redesign school funding in the state of Arizona. She really does know her stuff. We're very thankful to have her with us today. Please welcome Lisa Snell. We're going to do the wardrobe thing here.
Okay.
If you want to walk around, just take that with you.
Okay. Thanks so much. Well, I would like to say that Reason Foundation is also one of the organizations named in the lawsuit, and I think Barbara Boxer mentioned us as well on the Senate floor. So we are, I think it's like 50 organizations, or it's a pretty broad number of free market organizations that they've named in this free speech lawsuit. So it should be pretty interesting. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I actually came here from Las Vegas, where it was 108 degrees, but it was, of course, a dry heat. And here it feels about the same. I can't tell the difference that much. It's a wetter heat, as you all know. And I was on a panel at Freedom Fest on education freedom and education choice. And Freedom Fest used to be like kind of a rinky-dink little operation, but over the last few years it's really grown so that I think they had 1,000 people at their convention in Vegas, and really all kinds of different factions are represented. The Trump folks made quite an appearance at Freedom Fest, and but anyway, so let's talk about what has happened with education in North Carolina to start. So you guys just finished your short session, and there were a lot of things that happened. First of all, funding in the state of North Carolina was increased by $512 million, and largely that goes to boost teachers' salaries. And one positive thing, I guess, about that is there is a pilot program to actually try to connect performance of third graders to how the pay will be distributed. So while that's a modest reform and could be hijacked in many ways, it's always good when people start thinking about performance in relation to spending. And it's a miracle when you can get any amount of teacher pay or teacher spending linked to how students actually perform. Even more positive, the Opportunity Scholarship Program, which gives private vouchers to low-income students, was increased over the next decade. And I've heard that you have 22,000 kids with thousands of kids on the waiting list to get a scholarship to go to a private school or a higher performing school. And so the fact that that's going to be expanded to 10 million and then boosted every year until it's 144 million, I hear. If that actually happens, that's a positive increase. And then the special needs voucher program, which helps, kids with very specific kinds of needs, was increased. So North Carolina really is on the cutting edge in some ways in terms of school choice, because right now, although compared to 10 years ago when I first started doing this, when the only school voucher program was in Milwaukee and a small one in Cleveland, we've seen private school choice programs grow to 61 programs in 30 states, and North Carolina has 2 of those programs. So you guys really are on the cutting edge in terms of introducing actual private school choice programs. And this is from the Parents for Educational Freedom in North Carolina, a group that you guys are probably all familiar with, or many of you are familiar with. And they just broke down, like, right now, this year, they're projecting that 6,200 low-income kids would get school vouchers to go to a private school. And then by the end of the program, it would grow to over 35,000, close to 36,000 students being able to attend a private school. And that's all was accomplished in this legislative session. So very positive in terms of school choice. And you know, the good thing is that we know from the research and the empirical evidence on school vouchers and school choice that school choice works. And speaking of Milton Friedman Day, the Milton Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice, they put out a study called the Win-Win Solution in May of 2016, and they looked at 100 empirical studies on school vouchers, tax credits, and private school choice. And many of them were gold standard studies. Because of the way school choice programs are designed, you can actually have random assignment where a certain number of kids get school vouchers and then kids just like them don't get school vouchers, and you can compare the outcomes between the two. And the random assignment studies are especially impressive, but the big deal with all of these studies is that they improve academic outcomes for the kids that remain in the public schools. They improve academic outcomes for the kids that participate in the choice programs. They save taxpayers money. In fact, although there's only about 350,000 students nationwide in private choice programs, we're saving about $1.7 billion in tax money that would go to public schools because most private choice programs are lower cost. And then private choice programs actually have positive effects on racial segregation, which means that private school choice tends to be more integrated with more kids from different groups going to school together, especially because you think of the urban cities. They always make the claim that in school choice, charter schools or private schools or school choice, that would actually cause segregation because, you know, families would leave the public schools and flee to private schools to get, but actually the opposite happens. It turns out that the public schools in America, if you go to towns like Los Angeles or Compton or Cleveland or Detroit, are much more segregated based on government-enforced boundaries and residential assignment than actual private and public choice programs where people voluntarily choose to go to those programs. And then it also, the other thing that private choice is actually often dinged for is they make the claim that, oh, the public schools are the only place in America where you can learn civic values, and that, you know, they bring people together to learn about community and service and voting. And actually, it turns out that private school choice actually improves people's attitudes about civic engagement and community involvement and voting practices. And so even that claim about school choice turns out not to be right. Another thing that happened in your legislative session was called the Achievement School District, and it was introduced by Representative Rob Bryan. And it's a modest proposal to start where 5 of the lowest performing public schools, and I believe these are elementary schools, would be basically managed by an achievement school district, and a statewide superintendent would recommend independent entities to manage these low-performing schools. So basically they would get new management. And state superintendent, former state superintendent from Louisiana, Paul Pastorick, in 2005, he ran what they called the Recovery School District. And when Hurricane Katrina happened in New Orleans in 2005, basically the schools were disrupted, but they already had this state district in place. And all of New Orleans school districts were placed in this recovery school district because they all were low performing and eligible. So basically every school in New Orleans was at the bottom of the state ranking and at the bottom of the national ranking, and they would look similar to the 5 lowest performing schools in North Carolina. And so a lot of interesting things have happened in New Orleans, which basically the achievement school district model here is modeled after the New Orleans school district. And right now in New Orleans, they have 100% charter schools. So I think it was last year, the last public school became managed by a charter school. And so it's the only school district in the nation where nonprofit individual groups manage every public school. And they have what they call a common enrollment system. So you can go to any school in the city, and if you think about if you've had your children apply to college or you've heard about the college enrollment process, you do what you call a common application. So my daughter's 17, she just graduated from high school. And this last year, if you want to apply to Stanford or UC Berkeley or Vanderbilt, or you want to come here to North Carolina, there's a common application where you can send in an application to many schools. And so in New Orleans, they have a similar process for all the public schools in the state, and parents rank their top 5 choices and the reasons why they want to go to those schools. And in this last round of enrollment for next year, for 2016, 85% of students in New Orleans got one of their top 3 choices of public schools. And I think something like 56% of students got their top choice for schools. And that's a little bit different than college, because college you actually have to academically qualify, right? The school's rating you, you're not rating the school. So, but the other thing with the Common App, so there's this big study that Tulane just did about the process. Guess what the #1 reason parents picked public schools on that common enrollment application was for? School quality. So the most popular schools were the highest performing schools. And so that sends a message when you don't have residential assignment that parents do, even disadvantaged parents, low income parents, they're paying attention to quality, and if they have information, that's what they want. Guess what the second most popular reason for picking schools was? Any guesses?
Proximity.
Close.
Safety.
Safety, yep. Safety, and then proximity actually turns out to be third. But so parents are very concerned about academic quality, they're very concerned about safety, and they're very concerned, they do like to have schools. And that's the thing that the research from School Choice shows, is that when kids have the right of exit, we don't necessarily want kids to have to drive all over the city, right, 30 miles from their house. But it's just like when you go to the grocery store or a restaurant, or you have a cell phone provider, you still want, or the dentist, generally you still want to go to places that are close to your home. But the fact that you could go somewhere else, right? Like if you have a horrible store or a horrible restaurant, you don't have to go there. And guess what? When schools start facing the right of exit, most schools don't close. They change their behavior to keep families there. And so real quick, let's just go through some of the things that have happened in New Orleans. The grad rate there has gone from 54% to 73%. The college-bound grads have gone from 19 to 51%. And the typical student has improved by 8 to 15 percentile points. And we did a study at Reason where we used the Broad Pride methodology. And Eli Broad basically gives the top performing school district in the United States in terms of improvement for disadvantaged students $1 million in school scholarships for the students that belong to that district. And they call it the Broad Prize. And they've been able to rank different school districts using their methodology so that they're comparable, no matter what the state test is. And so in New Orleans, 100% of the money follows the student to the school. And that means that nobody, a central office, a school district, a state, the state keeps 2% for administration for the recovery school district, and then all the rest of the money is attached to the kid. And then these other districts here, they attach some money, like Baltimore attaches 25% of the money to the kids in their school district. But what we found in our Reason Foundation study is that when you looked at improvement over time, which is one of the things that Broad measures, and we aggregated all grade levels, high school, middle school, all subjects and all groups, that New Orleans improved the fastest and had the most money following the child. And we found an interesting thing. If you look at the bottom, 30% of the money following the child, all the way to New Orleans was 100% of the money following the child. In general, there was a pretty significant correlation between principals controlling resources and money following the child and how quickly student improvement improved. And the Broad methodology looked at improvement from 2009 to 2013, so it was over several years. And in fact, Tulane University just did a big study of New Orleans, which has the same model as the Achievement School District, and they found a 4% effect size for this charter school choice enrollment. And that's actually huge because in most education research, for things like universal preschool or class size reduction, which everyone loves, you see a much smaller effect size. And the researchers said in their report from Tulane, we are not aware of any other district that have made such large improvements in such a short time. And then just, another thing that confirms that is ACT scores, which is kind of an independent verification of state test scores, for New Orleans have jumped from the 25th to the 40th percentile. And again, New Orleans had rock bottom test scores. And they also are doing better than everyone else in Louisiana. In a matched comparison of the district, you can see that over time, New Orleans actually is outranking the state average. And then if you look at graduation, for every cohort, African American, students with disabilities, limited English, economically disadvantaged, New Orleans is actually graduating way more students than the state of Louisiana.
What I find surprising is how they got to 100%. When you look around the country, and I mentioned Diane Ravitch and people like that, there is such resistance.
Absolutely.
If you want choice, they will try to beat you down. And in a primarily democratic environment,
Right.
I get because they were struggling so much.
So, Governor Jindal was a help because it was during his time and he was a big advocate. But what made the difference is this school district, the recovery school district, which is like your achievement school district, because these schools were all so low scoring, and it also helped, the hurricane helped because it, not that you would want that to happen to the city of New Orleans, but it gave a historic opportunity because of the instability of the schools and the fact that literally almost all of the public schools, their contracts were void, and so the public school teachers and the union actually became defunct in a way. And then the state had this mechanism in place where if schools scored at a certain point, they could take them over. Before the hurricane, they hadn't taken them over. They were only doing a few at a time, like 5 at a time. But once there was a hurricane, they just implemented that recovery state level and said, we're going to manage all the schools in New Orleans, and we're going to contract them out, which is what the model said in law that they could do. And so that helped. And then the other thing is they really had a spirit of try again, where even charter schools, if they weren't performing well, after a couple of years, they would not keep them open. They closed schools relatively rapidly within 3 or 4 years, and they turned them over to higher performing operators. And they kept doing that. Like if you took over a school and you couldn't get it together in 3 years, then we're going to give it to this operator that can get it together. and everyone makes the argument, oh, but what about the kids? They'll be displaced. But it's really like the alternative is to have stability in like the worst performing school, or to keep getting, new people that will try to raise achievement. And so they went with the try again model, and it seems to have really helped in New Orleans. And then just, you can see the percentage of 8th grade black students scoring, which is still like a very low score. But if you look at the nation, like Massachusetts is really the only state that's even approaching like 50%, and New Orleans is doing better than everyone else. This is on the PARCC test, which was part of Common Core, so these are all people that took the same test for student achievement for schools. But again, it's just the thing about New Orleans is that there is multiple measures, whether it's ACT and SAT scores, graduation rates, state tests, that show that they're making rapid improvement. And also things like parent satisfaction. They've done these surveys where they ask if parents would ever want to go back to a traditional school district model. And the key thing is, in New Orleans, literally just like a Pell Grant for higher education, the money is in the backpack of the student. And they can take that school financing with them to any public school within the geographic region. And so charter schools, though, have seen relatively rapid growth. There were 500 new charter schools last year. There is 6,700 public charter schools in the United States. Close to 3 million students now go to charter schools. But what is significant about the story is there's places like DC where 60% of the kids go to charter schools. Where I live in Los Angeles, the school district has lost 200,000 kids in 6 years to charter schools. Now, they had 800,000, now they're under 600,000 students in the district. Now, a school district feels it when they lose 200,000 kids. And so while nationwide charter schools are growing in general, you have these pockets where, like DC, Los Angeles, New Orleans, Detroit, the majority of students, the market share is going to the charter market, and that's what's really flipping it. People have made these predictions that horrible things would happen in places like DC or New Orleans if you had so-called privatization of education. And in fact, the opposite is happening. Scores are rising, parental satisfaction is rising, college attendance is rising, and even criminal activity. Like there's a huge new body of research that shows that things like student suspension, incarceration rates, because people are really interested in how to reduce criminal justice issues in K-12 education. And it turns out that school choice really helps with that. If people voluntarily go to places where there's a relationship between the students and the teachers, and they're not mandatorily assigned, that it also has an effect on outside indicators. And then there's a lot of research now being done on long-term trends in terms of things like earnings, in terms of graduation rates, and then college completion. Because it's one thing to get kids into college, it's another thing if those kids finish. And so there's Jay Green at the University of Arkansas, who's a longtime school finance researcher, has shown that in fact these trends are lasting, and that these positive things are going all the way through college, and then the potential for earnings. And it's interesting because really the only long-term research we've had in education has been the argument for universal preschool, getting kids in state school earlier and at a younger age. And it turns out that charter schools, especially where a lot of the research has been done, are having higher impacts than universal preschool. And so that's a good thing. Choice works. So this is an interesting map because North Carolina is kind of an interesting place. All of those blue states are where the way that the state distributes money to school, and that's a portion of both property tax, local funding, and state tax, in most states it's student-based. And what that means is that even though the local school may not get it like New Orleans, when we talk about the formula that the state has, like a school district like Los Angeles in California, we have a weighted student formula, And from the state, you get $6,000 for a normal student, and then you get extra money for a low-income student, a foster care student, or an English language learner, but not all three. Like a student could be one criteria. And then your district gets extra money if you have a high concentration of poverty. So there's 3 ways you can get money. But it's super simple. Like, everyone understands it. Every district is getting money in the same way, and it's student-based. And although it's convoluted in a lot of states, still, in most of those blue places, the way it's explained to people is a per-pupil formula that goes to a school district based on the kids that enroll and their characteristics. And then North Carolina actually gives money based on positions or teachers and programming. So instead of starting with the students and saying, you know, here in Raleigh, the district has 45,000 students, I have no idea if that's true, and we get a base funding for each and we get these extra things, they say, no, you tell us how many programs and positions you have and then we'll fund those. So it's very interesting. It doesn't let the local education agency start with the money and decide what their priorities is. And that's what most school districts in America do. But in a way, North Carolina acts as a giant school district, giving centralized teacher raises, salary schedules, positions, and programming. And so it's different. And so in some ways, moving to student-based budgeting is harder. And I won't go through all of this, but this is a little infographic that I put together. And there's really some key problems. You have a lack of autonomy for educators, because if you have to say what your program is to start with to generate revenue, then it's very inflexible in terms of things like cost, or the other thing is the money follows the adults. So if you have a school district that has more experienced teachers or an individual school, you generate revenue by getting more experienced teachers to come to your school, not by getting students to come to your school. And so that really, if you have, 10 teachers at your school that have been teaching for 20 years and they make $65,000, and then another school over here with more disadvantaged kids that has a more difficult time attracting teachers, have 10 brand new teachers, and they make, say, $35,000 a year, there's no accounting for that difference in revenue, right? It's all driven by the salaries of the people that work in the building instead of the students that enroll and attend the building. So it's very insensitive. So it's somewhat inequitable for students. And then the other thing is it's a lack of transparency, because you can't go look at a school budget and find out the actual resources at that school that are being spent. And that's something that policymakers and taxpayers and normal families and citizens really would like to do. And the new reform of the No Child Left Behind Act, however you feel about that, it actually has a requirement that starting in 2018, every state will have to report out spending to the school level. And so with student-based budgeting, it's much easier to know how much money you're getting because when you look at salaries, they're usually averaged for a district or averaged for a state, and the information isn't very granular or transparent. So we want to make school funding more transparent as well. And so some of the recommendations are that you would go towards a simple formula and consolidate all of your federal, state, and local funding streams into one formula that every kid in the state would get. And then if they have special education needs or English language learner needs, you could weight those characteristics. But it's very easy to see what the school gets. And then that you would actually let that money follow the students to where they enroll. And that might be within a school district, or it might be to a charter school having the same funding stream for charter schools and public schools. It might be in Hawaii, they do this statewide. So like North Carolina, they have a centralized school district in Hawaii, but they have no local district bureaucracy, and literally the state education agency gives money to every school based on the characteristics of the school. And they've been doing this in Hawaii since about 2004. And interestingly, Hawaii has made the most progress of any state on the National Assessment of Education Progress. And that's like a benchmark by the nation that measures 4th grade reading and math, 8th grade reading and math, and 12th grade reading and math. And every state in the union takes this test. And so it's a way to benchmark state tests. And so Hawaii is doing very well. Okay. I'm going to skip through the rest of this stuff a little bit so that we can have a few questions. And I'm just going to close with education savings accounts. Have you guys heard of education savings accounts before? So the education savings accounts are kind of school choice 2.0. And the idea of an education savings account is realistically in the next 25 years, technology is going to play a much bigger role. And in fact, if you've been following the Pokemon Go craze around that has gotten kids out and about lately, and not just kids, right? 30-year-olds and 50-year-olds. And but it's clear that the primary way of having learning where you have the same teacher all day long and you sit in a classroom is probably not going to be, while it has been maintaining for 200 years or so, that there's a chance that technology will change that. And it may just be like there's a lot of models now for things like blended learning, where you say like rocket ship schools, their model out of Silicon Valley is you're with a teacher for part of the day, and then you have lower labor costs by doing individualized learning plans on the computer for part of the day. Or the flipped classroom, where at home you watch a lecture, and then when you come to school you do your calculus homework with a teacher and their assistants in the classroom. So you watch your lectures at home, you do your work in school where people can help you. There's all these different models. But the funding where we just give money to teachers isn't very responsive to how these funding models will change. And so Nevada became the first state to statewide adapt education savings accounts. And what happens with that is it's like a debit card. And each family gets $5,000, and they can add money to that. They're not restricted by that's all they can spend. But if they want to take online courses for free at MIT for half of the day and hire a tutor for part of the day, or they want to give their whole $5,000 to a Catholic school, they can do that. And if they save money, it rolls over to the next year. And they can use it for high school, or they can use it for higher education eventually. And it's called Education Savings Account. And there's several states, maybe 5, that have been doing this for a couple of years. Arizona has been doing it the longest. And there's a lot of research about how people are not stealing the money. They're being accountable, they're spending it on their kids, and the outcomes seem good for these kids. Now in Nevada, they are under an injunction right now. The ACLU basically has challenged the program on the same grounds that most school choice are challenged, that money would go to a religious school. And they have 4,000 kids that can't use their education savings accounts right now. And they're going to decide the case actually on July 29th will be the oral arguments. And actually the Milton Friedman Foundation has a huge campaign that is pegged to the Nevada court case. But that's really, if you want to look somewhere, how can you actually give parents not just a voucher for a new school or a tax credit, but complete control over the resources to manage in whatever way they want in a personalized savings account to get education services for their kids. And this year, 40 legislative bodies deliberated in the United States on education savings accounts. There were 4 new programs passed, and there were something like 18 or 25, I'm not sure which, that made it out of either the House or the Senate in different states, with 4 of them getting passed. And so really the whole school choice movement is putting their bet on the idea of education savings accounts. But it goes right along with whatever happens, we're moving toward connecting money to kids as customers to take to a variety of education providers. And that's really where the future of education is going, whether it's state funding or it's through an education savings account, because we can't just give arbitrary services anymore, because that's not how the world works. That's not a competitive vision for the future of education.
You didn't mention the U.S. Department of Education, and I wonder, is there any national meddling in what states want to do, or restriction? I can see the ACLU having one angle.
Right.
I wonder the
So,
role of the U.S. DOE.
I mean, there's a lot of national meddling, but not necessarily in school choice specific programs, although the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights has taken on not the New Orleans charter school market, but they have a small voucher program there, and they wanted to show that it created segregation or it was disproportional, but they haven't actually been successful in finding the evidence to show that. So there's always the potential for meddling, and of course the testing and accountability regimen by the federal government does impact school choice programs, because you do have to be accountable for special education, which is a huge, if you have a private school choice program, you don't have to do an IEP, but in a charter school you do, and you have to meet all of those FAPE laws. And so, yeah, I mean, with all of this is within the constraints of state and federal regulation, and there's still a lot of it. I mean, while I'm offering a promising view, it's still constant vigilance. And so if you think of education in America, in healthcare, we talk about a single payer, right? We have a $700 billion K through 12 education that has a single payer, a single provider, and the customers are assigned by residential assignment to each provider. So we literally, in education policy, have zero incentive towards performance, because the customers are assigned, the providers are a monopoly, and the funding is provided by the state. So still, we have a long way to go in terms, so when people get upset about health care, or they get upset about higher education being subsidized by the government, it would be a huge improvement if we could just enroll kids in the way that they apply to college. Even if you go to a state subsidized college, like in California we have UC and Cal State, one of the largest state provided higher education systems, it's still competitive. You have to put in applications and apply to all the different places, and the money follows you. And even within the same system, like UCLA is telling you why they're better than UC Santa Barbara or UC they're relentless. As a kid who got into 6 UCs, they're spending thousands of dollars trying to convince you to come to their school and why they do things better. I never heard that. Like, my public school assumed that I was coming, and I never heard one sentence about why my child should enroll in that school.
So I have a question about the critics' concern over dollars going to a religious school, and that's the basis of the ACLU
Right.
suit in Nevada.
Okay.
Well, but isn't that done at preschool and
Yes.
college level all the time?
So, in almost every other government market, we don't think anything right if someone goes to Loyola Marymount or some other Catholic college. All kinds of public dollars go to religious hospitals. They go to religious nonprofits. Certainly with preschool, notwithstanding Head Start, all other federal and state subsidies actually do follow the child, and they could go to the YMCA, or they can go to the Catholic or Baptist preschool. Nobody thinks anything of that, and they are competing. So even looking at the condition of higher ed and early education, we don't have a problem at all with that. And it is really, have you heard of Blaine amendments before? It really historically comes out of rivalry between Protestants and Catholics. And so, it was an and also the civic engagement that public schools have to be repositories of, it really was, public schools were designed to make immigrants toe the line, right? Poor Irish immigrants, poor Italian immigrants, that they would conform to be in acceptable society. And so those sentiments and the Blaine amendments in a lot of state constitutions are what actually have to be challenged, and where like the anti-religious bias comes from. But the Supreme Court has ruled on this, and they have found in favor of parents that it is not fundamentally the state that is making the decision about the school, it's the parent. And there's no inherent favoritism in school choice toward a religious school, right? If you get a savings account or a voucher or a tax credit, which have all three been challenged on these religious grounds, you can take them to any school you want. So it's been settled by the federal government, but then it's being resettled state by state with each state constitution. So far, so good. In general, the overall trend is toward letting parents decide between religious and non-secular schools.
You touched on this briefly, and I was thinking about this, is that in the I guess the best run companies, they have, I know when I've been, pay for performance.
Sure.
Is there any pay for performance state, where they're paying teachers for the quality of the work they do, rather than everybody gets the same pay based on
Right.
tenure and this and that?
Right. So, a big issue that is challenged is the idea, first off, not even just on performance, but the idea of differential pay. So it's not just that you would pay for performance, it's that it's harder to find a physics teacher than it is to find a physical education teacher. And so at a school, should I be allowed to have different compensation levels based on the demand and difficulty of the labor market, right, of finding teachers? So that's even just being able to do that, right, to differentiate between I don't have any special education teachers, and I can't offer a $1,000 bonus to get special education teachers no matter what, because there's a state set salary schedule. So there's a little bit of movement on that, and certainly, the charter school market has helped because those 6,700 schools can have pay for performance and differential pay, and there's a bunch, and it's like a laboratory of innovation about what works in terms of career paths that teachers can take, where, can I have someone that runs a math department at a charter school? Or can I have a model where I get the best math teacher in America and I record that teacher and they teach 1,000 students, and then I have a lower paid staff person that helps the kids, but the content comes from, this spectacular good math teacher. And so, we need a lot of experimentation like that. Now, there are statewide schemes that are in various legal constraints where, it's like the 25% of teachers that get third graders proficient in reading in North Carolina. There's a lot of little experimentation. There's a program called TAP by the Milken Foundation, and it's a private performance pay group, but it's in about 6,000 public schools in the United States. And but the problem with a lot of this is, like a lot of things, it's complicated because, if you have a teacher that is teaching, like, say, AP chemistry, you might be able to look at AP test scores and pay them for performance. But if you have a teacher that's teaching, like, some specialized class in Western civilization or literature, there may not be a test for that. And then, what do you do about, like, physical education or music or, so that's why, obviously there's things like ACT scores or SAT scores or graduation rates, but it's much better to hold schools accountable than to hold individual teachers accountable, because there's a lot of research that shows that if the team of the schools has the right to police their teachers, so this is a different labor contract issue. Like, as a principal, if I have a lemon teacher and I've evaluated them to be so, can I get rid of that teacher and hire someone else? In most places, no. I mean, or it's very expensive and it takes a long time and principals are discouraged from doing that, so they just don't. And so that's why just labor practices in general, we can't even get to performance because we try to put these schemes, right? Like we'll get, every third grader to read, whereas if principals could just manage their employees in like a normal way, obviously like where I work at Reason or here at John Locke, we have performance in the senses, are you writing, are you speaking, did you go on the radio, did you get a policy to change? But we don't have to have like a rubric, right, of performance metrics where I say, okay, I'm going to improve my op-eds by 40% next year, or I'm not going to get fired. And I mean, actually at Reason we do have that, but it's much more at the discretion of what is proper behavior, and managers decide if their folks are working or not. And in public schools, management has, even if they know, right, like that's what's so funny about all of these rating systems for teachers, is if you go to any principal at any school in America, I can guarantee you that they can tell you who their best teacher and their worst teacher is, and that would be 100% accurate based on the popularity from parents, the test scores, how the kids perform, the likability of the teacher. Like literally every principal knows who their teachers are that give them headaches every day and don't do their job, and who their best performing teachers are. And we want to have like a 200-point system to decide something that any principal in any public school, and in fact the students and the parents, would also tell you. Like, what is the teacher, the third grade teacher that the principal gets 100 emails and calls a year, I want to get into Mrs. So-and-so's class, right? I mean, there is even an informal market still working in public schools. It's just that people have to put in chips and cards and favors and call in things to try to get to work with the best people. And so that's why if we just had a more market-based system that worked like other industries, schools would naturally improve. But instead, we have to come up with all these faux markets based on things like performance. And I'm not saying that we don't have to do that. It is taxpayer money. And if you have, a school where you have, 20% of the kids are graduating. I mean, like in Compton, near LA where I live, Centennial High School, 2% of 10th graders read at grade level. 2%. Not one graduating student from Centennial High School qualifies for the Cal State University system, meaning that they have met the basic requirements, which is our easier university system to get into with lots of remedial education classes, not the UC system, which is at a much higher level of quality. Not one student at Centennial High School qualifies for that. And so you can't even meet like the basic metrics that are already set, and then we're trying to put all of these other metrics on top of that. And it really is fundamentally a monopoly system without customers that is a single provider and a single payer in America. Very depressing.
Okay, we can take one quick last question. I'll let you have that.
Oh, yeah. So in terms of curriculum flexibility, I know that the Washington, D.C. is trying to impose what curriculums they want public schools to be teaching. I imagine this choice program allows for more curriculum flexibility. But how about in the normal public schools?
Right.
Are we conforming more to Common Core? Are we giving more flexibility
So, I
to
mean,
teachers?
in my opinion, Common Core has been like a 4-year diversion from more choice and competition. And in the end, turns out, right, Common Core, as much as we had like these angsty debates about it, is on the way out, because the federal law basically, after Obama did all kinds of things to give, chits to get states to agree to do Common Core by giving them funding and not holding them accountable, the new authorization that they just passed, while it does still standardize things to a certain extent, offers a lot more flexibility. And so, you have like Louisiana just came out like last week, they ratified their state standards. Arizona's doing something anti-Common Core. In California, where I am, we've spent like $20 billion on implementing Common Core, so I imagine we're going to do it for a while. But, you know, I mean, it is, I mean, Common Core is a boogeyman in that people say, oh, it's the UN or it's this or it's that. But for most teachers, it's just like another set of like lines of text that someone's telling them that they have to teach kids. And I do think for some states, some of the content in Common Core is higher than what they were doing. So for instance, like Mississippi, and I'm not picking on them, they were at a much lower level. But then you have states like California, Indiana, and Massachusetts, where our state standards were phenomenal, and at the Brookings Institute, they've made this point over and over. You know, you can write anything down on a piece of paper. Like you can, like whether you like or hate Common Core or think it's the end of the world, in the end, it turns out that what the state writes down that kids need to know doesn't turn out to be what they learn. So in California, we were rated as having A+ standards for 20 years. And guess where we still rank on the National Assessment of Education Progress? 48th in 4th grade reading, 49th in 4th grade math, last in 8th grade. You know, like we had A+ world-class standards. And in the places where they implement them, well, fine. And so turns out there's no correlation between academic achievement and what the state writes down that the kids should know, right? That's not how it works. That's not what incentivizes the teachers to implement the right curriculum. You can have a great curriculum, and if you have a monopoly with no incentives, it doesn't make that much difference.
Lisa Snell from the recent
Thank you.
Foundation.